The first days of that late summer week in 1848 carried a heat so heavy it seemed to press itself into the very boards of the Whitmore estate, seeping into the walls and the shaded verandas like something alive. Observers in later years would describe the plantation grounds as well-ordered, hierarchical, or typical for the region, but accounts closer to the time speak instead of a quiet strangeness that clung to the place, a stillness that felt rehearsed rather than natural, an atmosphere in which every footstep, every doorway, and every word seemed to exist inside an unspoken arrangement of expectations. The house itself, an aging but care-maintained structure of pale timber and symmetrical windows, rose at the center like a study in control, cleanly painted, tightly shuttered, and arranged so that every approach to it could be seen long before a knock was heard at the door. From the outside, it communicated restraint and devotion. From within, it would become clear that the same traits were demanded of everyone who lived under its authority. Eleanor Whitmore appeared each morning in the open hallway before breakfast, usually holding a folded handkerchief and a prayer booklet, as though she were performing the closing moment of a private ritual. Her face was composed in the manner of someone who believed sincerity could be made visible through posture. The chin slightly raised, the gaze steady but soft, the shoulders drawn back in a near-monastic calm. Diaries from visiting relatives describe her not as severe, but as unwavering in her impressions and expectations, a phrasing polite enough to conceal the deeper sentiment they likely wished to avoid recording. Her reputation as a pious woman was maintained carefully, almost too carefully, through constant appearances of modesty, discipline, and charitable concern, yet those who spent longer periods near her noted a distinct tension beneath it, as though all that devotion functioned less as a belief system and more as a method by which the world could be arranged to her liking. Every day on the plantation followed a pattern that seemed designed to prevent reflection. Bells marked the beginning of tasks and the end of them. Pathways were taken not because they were pleasant, but because they were prescribed. Interactions followed a strict choreography of who spoke first, who bowed the head slightly, who stepped aside. Even the weather, brutal as it was, felt secondary to the hierarchy that shaped everything. Those who labored in the fields kept their movements measured and quiet, speaking only when necessary, and those working within the house appeared almost synchronized, as if their silences and glances were part of the daily routine rather than reactions to it. The Whitmore family members, for their part, moved through the space with a kind of uneasy politeness, honoring tradition while carrying beneath their measured voices an unmistakable undertone of anxiety, an alertness that suggested an internal life more complicated than their outward compliance allowed. Eleanor noticed everything. Her presence was not loud or forceful. Rather, it was defined by a watchfulness that made people straighten their backs without realizing they were doing so. She held her prayers at slightly irregular times, perhaps intentionally, so that no one around her could fully predict when she would reappear after withdrawing into the small upstairs parlor that she called her quiet room. From that space, she often claimed she could hear the spirit of the house, a phrase later repeated by her niece in a letter that historians still cite when attempting to understand the psychological dynamics of the household. Whether Eleanor meant the phrase metaphorically or not, the result was the same. The family became progressively more cautious, and the enslaved workers sensed a tightening of the invisible boundaries that already governed their every movement. Rumors circulated discreetly, as they always did in environments built on silence. One such whisper suggested that Eleanor had recently discovered a private note exchanged between two of her own relatives, a note whose contents were never publicly disclosed but which, according to second-hand testimony, had left her unusually cold that morning at breakfast. Another rumor described a lamp left burning in one of the back corridors past midnight, something that violated the household's strict economy of materials. The lamp had been found extinguished by morning, but Eleanor was seen standing near the corridor door just before sunrise, her expression unreadable. The incident was small, almost trivial, yet it lingered in the air the entire day, shaping the way people carried themselves, as though the light itself had revealed something better left unseen. There were other small signs that something in the established order was fracturing. A door left slightly ajar in the pantry when it was expected to remain shut. A half-finished chore that should never have been abandoned. Footprints on the side path that led behind the smokehouse, where no one was supposed to walk unless directed. Individually, these anomalies meant nothing, but collectively they formed the faint tremor of a deeper unrest, one that the household could sense even if no one could name it. People watched one another with polite uncertainty, the way they might observe a storm on the horizon, too distant to flee from, but too dark to ignore. Letters from a visiting cousin describe a moment that would later be interpreted as one of the first turning points. She wrote of a morning when Eleanor paused at the threshold of the main dining room, looking not at the table or the people setting it, but at a single loose thread on the hem of a uniform apron. Her gaze lingered just long enough to unsettle the young woman wearing it. Eleanor said nothing, no instruction, no correction, no demand, but the silence was so pointed that the young woman's hands began to shake. The cousin noted that the mistress's expression in that moment carried the weight of something unspoken, as though she were measuring not the garment, but the soul of the one wearing it. Such moments, small on the surface, created a tension that radiated throughout the day. Everyone felt it, even those who did not witness it directly. The oppressive atmosphere was not the product of open conflict, but of the constant awareness that conflict could arise at any moment, over matters so slight they could not be anticipated. This uncertainty bred a quiet guilt in all who lived there. The guilt of wondering whether they had contributed to some unseen offense, the fear that their compliance might not be enough, the suspicion that their obedience itself could be misconstrued. It is impossible to determine from surviving documents whether Eleanor intended this effect, but the consistency with which it shaped the household suggests at least an unconscious desire to maintain a level of emotional dependence and vigilance among those around her. To outside observers, the plantation might have appeared orderly, devout, and well-governed. But within the house, a different reality pulsed beneath the surface, one defined by the weight of unspoken expectations, the subtle demands of surveillance, and the simmering awareness that daily routines were not simply tasks but tests. Each rustling curtain, each distant sound from the fields, each slight change in someone's tone of voice seemed to carry a significance that could not be easily articulated. And so, in those first days of the narrative, the emotional landscape shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably, towards something heavier, something unbalanced, something that suggested the fragile equilibrium of the household was beginning to tilt under pressures still sensed only in fragments. The documentary record, sparse as it is, notes no single event that marks the true beginning of the conflict that would later unfold. Instead, it points to the accumulation of these minor disruptions, these subtle frictions, as the earliest evidence that the plantation's internal order was quietly rearranging itself. A shadow crossing a doorway at the wrong time. A hesitation in a reply. A glance exchanged quickly and then suppressed. The smallest variables, observed through the lens of hindsight, appear almost like warnings. And yet, in the moment, life continued. Breakfast was prepared. Chores were completed. Eleanor offered her measured blessings before meals. The bells rang at their appointed hours. But beneath the familiar sounds of the estate, whined through the pine trees, wagon wheels on dry earth, distant hymns from the quarters, another sound began to emerge, the faint, collective, unvoiced tension of a world about to shift. In the days that followed those early disturbances, the household settled, or seemed to settle, into a pattern that resembled calm, but carried beneath it a pulse of unease far stronger than before. The heat did not lift. Instead, it deepened into a stagnant heaviness that left the air tasting faintly metallic at dawn and thick with dust by late afternoon. People moved more slowly, as though trying not to disturb the atmosphere itself, and conversations that once took place freely in the outer corridors now occurred only in brief fragments, traded in doorways or behind half-closed shutters. Each of these small behavioral changes, noted in later recollections, indicated not simply discomfort but anticipation, a shared sense that Eleanor Whitmore's expectations were shifting into something more exacting, more searching, and considerably less forgiving. Within the family, the tension surfaced first as polite disagreements about trivial matters, placement of linens, timing of meals, the order of morning prayers. But even these seemingly harmless exchanges revealed something deeper. Eleanor's younger sister, Margaret, who had arrived for what was meant to be a short visit, found herself corrected frequently, often for gestures so minor they hardly merited comment. A misplaced syllable, a hesitation before responding, an overly familiar tone toward one of the house staff. Any of these could draw one of Eleanor's soft yet unmistakably precise remarks. They were never framed as rebukes. Instead, they were posed as gentle reminders, suggestions meant to encourage proper harmony within the home. But the effect they produced was unmistakable. Margaret grew quieter, more cautious, and more observant of Eleanor's shifting moods than she had ever been in childhood or adolescence. It was around this time that family testimonies, diary entries, later letters, and one unsigned written account discovered in a trunk decades afterward began to reveal the extent to which Eleanor's influence shaped not only the household structure but the inner lives of those around her. The accounts describe her as increasingly insistent on knowing how each member of the family spent their hours, which errands they supervised, which conversations they overheard, which concerns they witnessed but did not report. These questions were never asked directly, at least not according to surviving testimony. Instead, they appeared in the form of gentle inquiries during morning tea or soft remarks inserted into evening prayers, phrased in ways that made refusal feel like a betrayal of familial love rather than a simple desire for privacy. The first significant ripple came one morning when Eleanor summoned her nephew, Thomas, to speak with her in the upstairs sitting room. He later told his wife, in a letter preserved by her descendants, that the conversation began with what seemed like benign concern. Eleanor inquired about his well-being, his sleep, his impressions of the estate's operations. But soon her tone shifted toward something more pointed. She asked whether he had noticed any restlessness among the workers, any signs of agitation or divided loyalty. He, unsure how to interpret the question, replied cautiously that he had observed nothing unusual. She nodded, smiling faintly, and suggested that sometimes quiet behavior hides deeper undercurrents, urging him to remain attentive. The implication was unmistakable, even if he struggled to articulate it afterward. She wanted him to watch, to listen, to report. That same week, Thomas found himself lingering longer in spaces he once passed through without thought. The shaded walkway between the smokehouse and the main hall, the narrow hallway near the kitchen door, the outer steps where water buckets were filled each morning. His movements were hesitant, uncertain, marked by a growing fear that he might see something he did not want to see, or worse, fail to see something Eleanor believed he ought to notice. Each evening he felt compelled to offer her a summary of the day's observations, even though she had never expressly demanded such reports. Her subtle questions, her precisely calibrated interest, created a pressure that made silence feel like concealment. Margaret, observing this but saying nothing, grew increasingly anxious. Her letters from this period describe a house, too full of listening, a place where voices echoed oddly down the hallways, as if the very architecture amplified uncertainty. She wrote of a moment when she passed Eleanor on the stairwell and found her standing motionless, one hand resting on the banister, her eyes focused not on Margaret, but on a point beyond her, an expression Margaret later described as calculating, though not unkind. The look lasted only a second, but it left her with the unmistakable sense of having been weighed and assessed, as though Eleanor were quietly composing an opinion she had no intention of sharing. The tension that had begun as subtle now advanced into something more direct. One afternoon, during preparations for a visiting clergyman, Eleanor confronted her husband, Nathaniel, regarding a discrepancy in the household accounts, an issue so minor it would normally have been dismissed with a quick explanation. But Eleanor seized upon it, questioning him with a quiet intensity that surprised even those accustomed to her meticulous nature. She asked him whether he had delegated certain responsibilities too freely, whether he trusted the judgment of the people performing those tasks, and whether oversight had grown lax in areas where discipline was essential. He attempted to reassure her, but she pressed further, implying that negligence, however small, could allow deeper disorder to creep in unnoticed. This incident, recorded in a journal kept by Nathaniel's own brother, marked the beginning of a new pattern. Eleanor began to probe, to use the brother's word, into details that most families would have left unexamined. She inquired about misplaced tools, lingering glances, the reasons behind late arrivals, even the emotional tone of conversations heard in passing. These questions, always delivered gently, functioned as a kind of moral net cast over the household, catching even the smallest deviations and drawing attention to them. It is unclear whether she believed these matters held any real significance or whether her scrutiny served primarily to reinforce her position. Either interpretation, however, carried the same effect. Everyone around her grew more cautious, more secretive, and more anxious about the interpretation of their actions. It is in this period that the first acts of quiet betrayal took place. The records do not agree on who initiated the first one, whether a family member or someone working within the house, but several accounts describe a moment when Eleanor received a whispered confidence about a routine that had been performed incorrectly. What the mistake was remains unrecorded, likely because the person revealing it never wished the detail to be preserved. But its impact is documented clearly. Eleanor's manner that afternoon was serene, almost tender, yet the next day the individual responsible for the small error found themselves subjected to an unusual degree of scrutiny. Their tasks were inspected with greater frequency, their movements observed more closely, and several of their usual responsibilities were quietly reassigned. It was a subtle punishment, the kind that carried no explicit accusation but created an unmistakable sense of being singled out. Soon, more whispers followed. Family members, shaped by the fear of falling short of Eleanor's expectations, found themselves reporting small observations they might once have dismissed. These were not malicious betrayals, at least not intentionally. They were acts born of uncertainty, offered as preemptive displays of loyalty to the one figure whose judgment seemed to define the entire moral structure of the home. But each whispered comment, each half-formed suspicion, added another layer to the growing atmosphere of distrust. The psychological weight for the family grew heavier. Thomas became restless, sleeping poorly, waking at night from indistinct dreams of being called by name down long corridors. Margaret developed a habit of touching the hem of her dress when anxious, rubbing the fabric between her fingers. Nathaniel, usually calm and deliberate, began to avoid eye contact during conversations, responding to Eleanor's inquiries with rehearsed phrases that carried more caution than conviction. Each of them, in their own way, tried to reconcile their desire for domestic peace with the creeping fear that Eleanor's expectations were becoming impossible to satisfy. In this environment, small decisions acquired the gravity of turning points. Thomas, attempting to ease his aunt's concerns, fabricated a minor detail about an overheard conversation, something he thought would confirm vigilance but not cause harm. That detail, however, reached Eleanor at a moment when she was particularly attuned to signs of disobedience, and it became for her a piece of a larger pattern she believed she was uncovering. The fabricated story, meant to calm her, instead intensified her vigilance. It was, in retrospect, a decision that could not be undone, one that set in motion a chain of assumptions and inquiries that would shape the direction of the coming conflict. Around this time, Eleanor began working on what relatives later called her plan, though the nature of that plan was never written explicitly in any surviving document. What is known is that she began spending long hours in her quiet room, reviewing ledgers, letters, and small records of daily behavior. She spoke less during meals and prayed longer in the evenings, often lingering in the hallway afterward as though listening for something she expected to hear. Members of the family noticed her increased distance but interpreted it in different ways, some as a sign of spiritual preoccupation, others as a sign of suspicion, still others as an attempt to consolidate authority in a household she believed was slipping into disorder. The tension escalated further when a set of instructions Eleanor had quietly issued was discovered, though not by the person for whom it was intended. These instructions, written in her neat cursive hand, outlined a new order of responsibilities that subtly reorganized the household's internal structure. Tasks once overseen by one family member were reassigned, pathways once commonly used were restricted, and routines that had gone unquestioned for years were suddenly replaced. This reorganization was not presented as punishment or correction, but as an improvement, a refinement of efficiency. Yet those who read the document felt immediately its deeper implication. Eleanor was positioning herself not merely as caretaker or supervisor, but as the central intelligence of the entire estate, the interpreter of all its moral and functional movements. Conversations behind closed doors grew more urgent. People began speaking in lowered tones, glancing over their shoulders before continuing, aware that even the walls seemed to echo more than before. Margaret confided in Thomas that she felt something unnatural was unfolding, not in supernatural terms, but in the sense that human behavior was warping under invisible pressures. Thomas, already burdened by the false report he had given, tried to reassure her, but carried his own fears like a weight he could not set down. Nathaniel attempted to intervene by suggesting that Eleanor rest more, perhaps take a short visit to her sister's home, but the suggestion was met with a serene refusal. Eleanor insisted she was acting out of duty and moral responsibility, that the household's welfare depended on vigilance and clarity. It was during a late evening prayer session, when the candles flickered strangely in a draft that no one could identify, that the first true confrontation occurred. Eleanor paused mid-prayer and asked those present whether they felt the distraction that had crept into the household. She spoke not of physical disruptions, but of moral ones, of misplaced loyalty, faltering discipline, shadows of hesitation in the hearts of those meant to uphold the household's harmony. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, filled with the unspoken knowledge that she was not speaking abstractly, but directly, pointedly, to the people sitting before her. No one dared ask what she meant. No one dared confess. No one dared contradict her. In the days that followed, the household's emotional terrain shifted yet again. Tasks were performed with greater caution, as though every motion might carry new significance. People avoided lingering in hallways, avoided speaking in groups, avoided anything that might appear conspiratorial. Even the weather seemed to reflect the deepening tension. The skies turned a shade of dull white, the air thick with anticipation of a storm that refused to break. The plantation felt sealed in a strange, suffocating stillness, as though waiting for a revelation none of its occupants wanted to face. And through it all, Eleanor moved with a calm, deliberate grace that made her intentions impossible to interpret. Her outward demeanor remained gentle, devout, unassailable. But behind the composed exterior lay a growing certainty that something within the estate required correction, and that she, through quiet vigilance and divine guidance, was the one meant to carry out that task. Her plan, still unspoken, had taken root. Weeks passed, and with them the quiet, almost invisible threshold between tension and something heavier. The estate no longer felt like a place where routines simply unfolded. It felt watched, curated, and deliberately arranged, as though the air itself had been reshaped to mirror Eleanor Whitmore's intent. Even the weather seemed to move in patterns that suited her. Long afternoons of stagnant heat, evenings thick with the smell of wood smoke, nights in which the crickets fell silent too early, leaving an unnatural stillness around the house. Eleanor had grown more deliberate in those weeks. Her movements held a new certainty, sharper and less hesitant than before. At first, the family barely recognized the shift, perhaps because it was not loud or theatrical. Instead, it was measured. She woke earlier than anyone else, sometimes before dawn, and would sit in the front parlor with the curtains open, letting the dim blue morning seep in. Neighbors later recalled seeing her silhouette framed in that window, motionless, as though surveying a world she was in the process of remaking. The household felt her decisiveness long before they understood its purpose. Rooms that once hummed with quiet domestic noise now carried a sense of restrained surveillance. The servants, who had always moved with practiced caution, began navigating hallways as though even their footsteps required approval. Children's laughter, once tolerated in the afternoons, retreated to the far edges of the yard. And the family, those few relatives who lived in the house, found themselves measuring each word before it crossed their lips. Thomas, her husband's younger cousin, seemed especially affected. Once known for his restless energy, he now spent hours in the stables, brushing the horses again and again with no real need. There was a nervous tremor beneath his calm gestures, a tension in the way he would straighten suddenly and glance toward the house, as though expecting to be summoned. He did not fear Eleanor in any obvious or dramatic sense, but something in her new composure unsettled him deeply. Her presence had become a constant variable in his decisions, a quiet authority shaping his choices. Margaret grew quieter too, but her silence felt different, almost thoughtful. She listened more closely than before, absorbed more, seemed to feel the weight of the atmosphere with a particular sensitivity. Sometimes she would begin a sentence, hesitate, and reshape it midway, as though uncertain which truths were still safe to speak aloud. She had always been dutiful, always careful, but now she carried an internal conflict that softened her posture and darkened her expression. It was clear she understood more about Eleanor's intentions than she let on, and it was equally clear she wasn't sure what to do with that knowledge. By the time the third week drifted into the fourth, the estate had come to resemble an arrangement of quiet performances. Every action was calculated, every decision, however small, was made in relation to something larger and more ominous. And then the household began to sense, without fully grasping, what Eleanor was preparing for. It started with the ledger. No one knew precisely when she had begun altering it. The household accounts had always been kept by Thomas, who took meticulous pride in balancing each month's entries with a precision that bordered on ritual. But as he worked late one humid evening, he found figures out of place. Entries moved from one column to another, labor schedules rewritten in a finer hand than his own, and notations added in neat, slanted script that unmistakably belonged to Eleanor. She had not touched the numbers themselves. She had touched the narrative they created. Margins once blank now bore short observations about reliability, temperament, and potential disruptions. The ledger had ceased to be a record of estate operations. It had become a document of classification, one that sorted people by her own private logic, one that amplified her control by transforming her suspicions into written evidence. Thomas confronted her only once, late at night in the parlor, and even then his voice carried more exhaustion than defiance. He asked why she had rewritten his records. Eleanor did not argue. She simply observed that she was documenting matters he had overlooked, details necessary for maintaining order. Her tone was gentle but inflexible, the tone of someone who believed the argument had been resolved before it began. Thomas said nothing more after that, but he slept poorly for days, and the household noticed. Meanwhile, the enslaved community sensed the shift in ways the family could not articulate. They saw the increased supervision, the longer pauses in conversations between the white family members, the sudden corrections in routine that made little sense but carried unmistakable warning. A few of them whispered about changes in Eleanor's eyes, how she watched not only actions but silences, how she stood at the veranda railing in the evenings, not merely observing the yard, but reading it, studying it, searching it. There were small disruptions, too, the kind that seem inconsequential but signal profound change. A locked door left open one morning. A servant's path suddenly rerouted for no reason. A misplaced household key discovered in a room where it had no business being. Rumors began forming in the shadows of these details. Rumors of new restrictions, new expectations, new punishments that were never spoken aloud but hung like invisible laws over the estate. One night, during a particularly warm spell, a storm gathered on the horizon. Its clouds moved slowly, hardly advancing at all, as if waiting for the right moment. The air smelled of iron and dust. Cicadas grew louder and then abruptly cut off, leaving a void that amplified every human sound. It was on this night that Margaret confessed, quietly, almost trembling, to Thomas that she believed Eleanor was preparing something official, something that would involve not just the household but the authorities beyond it. Margaret didn't know the details, but she had seen the sealed letter Eleanor had mailed 2 weeks earlier, seen the way Eleanor had stood over the envelope as though sealing not a message but an agreement with herself. She had also overheard Eleanor rehearsing phrases at her writing desk, phrases about order, duty, difficult decisions, necessary measures. None of the sentences were completed, but each carried enough implication to unsettle. Thomas listened, his face pale even in the dim lamplight. The storm clouds pulsed faintly in the distance, as if echoing the rise of their anxiety. He asked Margaret what she believed Eleanor wanted. Margaret shook her head. "Control," she whispered. "Not destruction, not chaos, just control, but absolute. And she thinks she's losing it." In the following days, Eleanor acted with a poise that only confirmed Margaret's fears. She initiated new routines, small ones, almost impossible to question individually. A new schedule for evening inspections, a revised rotation for nighttime duties, stricter curfews, a requirement that all household keys be collected and returned directly to her room by nightfall. The family watched her take on these responsibilities without hesitation, as though she had been waiting for an excuse to centralize every mechanism of authority. She walked the estate with her hands clasped behind her back, her gaze steady, the soft rustle of her dress the only sound emanating from her. And she spoke less now, as if conserving her words for something that required precision. The pressure grew incrementally, building not in sudden events, but in the accumulation of small inevitabilities. People began to accept things they would have questioned only weeks before. Secrets multiplied. Conversations shortened. Private doubts expanded into something akin to dread. It was around this time that Eleanor received a letter in return, one that arrived midday, delivered by a courier who seemed in a hurry to leave the estate grounds. She read it in the study with the door firmly closed. When she emerged, her expression had changed subtly, a faint satisfaction around the eyes, an unspoken confirmation. She said nothing to the family, but everyone felt the shift, the tightening of something they could not yet see. By the end of the week, signs of destabilization became unavoidable. Thomas grew more isolated, withdrawing even from the stables. Margaret seemed torn between fear and a last, fragile attempt at moral clarity, weighing her responsibility against her own survival. Even the children sensed the tension, waking from dreams they could not articulate, wandering corridors at night with the dazed confusion of sleepers caught in someone else's unrest. And through all of it, Eleanor moved with unwavering calm, as though the estate had entered a phase she had foreseen and prepared for. There were no outbursts, no dramatic confrontations, only the creeping awareness that something irreversible was approaching, that a line had been crossed quietly, almost invisibly, and that the household, in ways none of them understood yet, had already stepped into the first shadow of the coming crisis. The old order hadn't collapsed. It had begun to rot, slowly and silently, from within. The confrontation, when it finally surfaced, did not come with shouts or sudden violence. It came instead with a muted swiftness, as though the air itself had been waiting for a signal. For days the estate had felt poised on the edge of something imminent. Even the weather had grown strange, heavy, laced with an electrical sharpness that flickered in the sky during the late hours. Everyone sensed that the quiet was about to fracture. And yet, when it happened, it felt as though it had already begun long before any of them recognized it. It started with the disappearance of a single ledger page. Thomas discovered it at dawn, the thin sheet torn cleanly from the book, the faint imprint of Eleanor's handwriting visible on the preceding page like an afterimage. The missing entry was one she had written herself, one of her quiet assessments of reliability and temperament. It was the only page in the entire volume that contained notes made entirely in her own hand. Thomas stared at the blank space, feeling a hollowness settle in his chest. The room smelled of stale ink and dust, the window shutters letting in a humid morning breeze that made the remaining pages flutter like restless wings. He told no one at first. He simply closed the ledger, placed it on the shelf, and walked out into the yard with the look of a man who has realized that all the choices he avoided have finally converged. Margaret found him there an hour later, standing silently beneath the large oak at the edge of the house, staring at the fields without seeing them. When she asked what troubled him, he merely shook his head, but she felt the tension radiating from him, tightening the air between them like an invisible cord. Inside the house, Eleanor moved with an almost serene clarity. She was preparing something, though no one could name it. Her dress was immaculate, her hair pinned with an exactness that suggested she intended to be seen or to bear witness to something. She spoke to no one that morning, yet her presence was felt in every room as though she carried the center of the household's gravity within her. By midday, whispers began spreading. Someone had gone missing, not from the family, but from the enslaved community. A young woman named Clara, known for her calm demeanor and careful work in the kitchen, had not returned to her assigned tasks. At first there was confusion, then concern, then something darker. No one had seen her since the previous night. Her absence was not only irregular, it was dangerous. Even the slightest deviation from routine now felt like the beginning of a chain reaction. Margaret was the first to bring this news to Eleanor, her voice trembling, her face pale as she tried to keep emotion from spilling into her words. Eleanor listened with a stillness that unnerved her. She offered no immediate instruction, no sign of alarm. Instead, she asked, in a calm, deliberate tone, when exactly the absence had been noticed. Margaret answered carefully, watching Eleanor's face for some hint of reaction. But her expression remained unreadable, not indifferent, but controlled in a way that suggested she had anticipated something similar. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice held a quiet authority that echoed through the hallway. "Find Thomas." Margaret obeyed without question, though her hands shook. She found him near the stables, shoulders slumped, his shirt damp with the heat. When she relayed the message, he closed his eyes for a moment, as though gathering strength, then followed her back toward the house with slow, measured steps. The cicadas' drone grew louder, almost oppressive, as they neared the veranda. Eleanor stood waiting for them in the parlor, the shutters half closed, the lights slanting in thin beams that dust motes drifted through. Her posture was immaculate, her composure absolute. Thomas felt an unease he could not hide, a tension in his jaw, a faint tremor in his fingers. He knew something was coming, something he had long feared but had hoped might never materialize. She asked him a single question. "Do you know where the missing page is?" He froze. Margaret's breath caught. For a moment, the room seemed to contract, the silence drawing tight around them. Thomas shook his head slowly, the truth heavy in his eyes even if he did not speak it aloud. Eleanor did not accuse him. She did not raise her voice. She simply watched him with a profound stillness, as though his silence itself confirmed everything she had suspected. The weight of her gaze pressed against him like an indictment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a faint sorrow, or perhaps it was disappointment. "It was the only record I kept entirely for myself. Whoever removed it has altered the truth, and now the consequences fall on this house." Margaret stepped forward, unable to contain her fear. "What consequences?" she whispered. Eleanor turned her gaze toward the window, where the fields stretched outward in muted gold under the sun. "Clara fled in the night," she said, "and someone in this household aided her." The words fell with the weight of a revelation. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas staggered back a step, his face draining of color. None of them had imagined that Clara's disappearance might be anything more than fear-driven solitude. But Eleanor's certainty, the firmness of her tone, made the truth feel immovable. What followed unfolded with a rapid, suffocating intensity. Eleanor moved to her writing desk, retrieving a sealed letter, the one she had received days earlier. She held it as though it were a key, something that unlocked the final stage of her plan. She explained, calmly, methodically, that she had already communicated with the local authorities regarding disruptions within the estate. The letter in her hand was their reply. They would arrive by evening. Margaret's heart seemed to stop. Thomas whispered a single word, "Eleanor," but she silenced him with an almost gentle shake of her head. "It cannot be undone now," she said, "but it can be managed." The fear that settled over the household in the hours that followed was unlike anything it had experienced before. It was not fear of punishment, nor of physical harm. It was the dread of being drawn into a moral reckoning none of them were prepared to face. Every choice they had made in recent weeks, every silence, every compromise, every small betrayal, now stood exposed in the harsh light of Eleanor's certainty. The enslaved community felt the shift instantly. They saw the riders approaching before the family did. A small group of officials, their coats dark against the pale road, dust rising behind their horses like a silent storm. The sight sent a ripple of panic through the yard, though no one dared to show it openly. Conversations dropped to whispers, movements stiffened, children were pulled close by trembling hands. Margaret watched the riders from the upstairs landing, her breath shallow, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. Thomas stood beside her, the two of them united in a silent dread. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. They both understood that the moment the riders dismounted, the fragile order of the estate would shatter. Eleanor met the officials at the door with the composure of a woman greeting invited guests. Her voice was steady, her posture unmistakably authoritative. She led them into the parlor, offering explanations in precise, measured tones. Margaret could hear fragments of her speech drifting up the staircase. Phrases about security, breach of protocol, suspected assistance, and necessary intervention. Every word struck Margaret like a blow. But when the officials asked to question the family, Eleanor hesitated for the first time. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around her eyes, but Margaret saw it. Eleanor was not immune to fear. She simply refused to let it determine her actions. She invited them to speak with Thomas first. Thomas descended the stairs like a man walking toward the edge of a precipice. The room felt smaller when he entered it, the air thicker. The officials asked him simple questions: where he had been the previous night, whether he had noticed anything unusual, whether he had interacted with Clara recently. His answers were honest, but his fear made them sound evasive. He felt as though every truth he spoke became a lie in their ears. It was Margaret who broke first. Unable to bear the sound of Thomas's halting explanations, she rushed into the parlor, insisting that the officials speak with her as well. She admitted she had overheard Clara speaking with someone days earlier, though she had not understood the full meaning at the time. She described a sense of growing instability, a pressure that had distorted the household's moral clarity. She spoke tremblingly, stumbling over her words, her voice cracking with guilt. Eleanor watched her with an expression that was almost sorrowful, but not surprised. The officials listened, their expressions stern but not cruel. They took notes, exchanged glances, asked pointed questions. The house seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the sky darkened prematurely as thick clouds gathered, the air sharpening with the smell of impending rain. When the questioning ended, Eleanor stepped forward. Her voice remained calm, but there was something in it now that felt exposed, not vulnerable, but revealed. She acknowledged that the household had suffered a lapse, and that she bore responsibility for restoring order. Her final request was simple: that the officials allow her to handle the internal consequences herself. It was a request rooted in both pride and fear. The officials considered it, their gazes drifting across the tense room. Finally, they agreed, not out of deference, but because they saw a woman already enacting her own judgment, one that did not require their intervention. As they departed, the storm finally broke. Rain struck the roof in hard, uneven bursts. Lightning flickered over the fields, illuminating the estate in stark, ghostly flashes. Thunder rolled in the distance, drawing nearer with each passing minute. The house was quiet after the officials left, but it was a precarious quiet, a fragile shell around a breaking core. Margaret retreated to her room in tears. Thomas sat alone in the study, staring at the empty space where the missing page had once been, unable to escape the knowledge that his silence had shaped the day's events as much as Eleanor's resolve. And Eleanor walked slowly through the corridors, her candle casting long, trembling shadows along the walls. Her face was composed, but inside her something had fractured. Not her authority, that remained intact, but her certainty. The storm outside mirrored the storm she had unleashed within her own house. By nightfall, the estate felt transformed. Relationships had ruptured, trust had eroded, and every moral compromise made in the preceding weeks now stood exposed in the stark aftermath of the confrontation. No physical violence had erupted, no overt cruelty had been displayed, yet the psychological devastation was profound. Every character carried the weight of what they had witnessed or enabled, the weight of choices made too late, the weight of a system that demanded obedience even as it devoured itself. The horror of that day came not from blood, but from truth. Not from chaos, but from the cold machinery of power. Not from screams, but from silence. The household slept uneasily beneath the storm, knowing that nothing, not loyalty, not routine, not the facade of order, could restore what had been lost. The climax had come and gone, but its consequences had only begun. In the days that followed the confrontation, the Whitmore estate remained outwardly unchanged, yet the air itself had grown heavier, denser, as though the house had absorbed the weight of the choices made within it. Sunlight spilled across the floors in the morning, but it carried no warmth, only the stark illumination of everything that could not be unseen. People moved differently now, their steps measured and careful, their voices quiet, sentences truncated before they could fully form, gestures minimized as if any outward motion might betray thought. The household, once a place of practiced routines and discrete hierarchies, had become a network of shadows and silences, each inhabitant negotiating the invisible pressures imposed by what had transpired. Eleanor Whitmore no longer summoned her family or household members into her deliberate performances of authority. She walked the halls alone, her presence absolute and deliberate, a slow and careful observation of her own dominion, as though the walls themselves were extensions of her will, and she was now less mistress than warden of a quiet, suspended world. Her husband, Charles, retreated into his office for meals and spent hours at his desk, shuffling papers he had no intention of delivering, staring at letters he could not bring himself to send. The events had hollowed him out in subtle ways. His back stiffened, his eyes a little duller, his voice quieter. He replayed the confrontation again and again, Eleanor's calm, unwavering gaze fixed upon him, a silent demand that he account for every hesitation, every unspoken thought. It was not rage she used, but certainty, and the kind of certainty that bends others to its logic without overt coercion. The children, perceptive in ways adults often underestimate, had begun to navigate the house in avoidance. The corridors and rooms that had once been familiar were now tainted by the echo of authority and betrayal. They moved in hushed patterns, playing in corners or behind furniture, their laughter carefully muted. They carried the unease in their steps, the pause in their play, a quiet testament to the intangible pressure now woven into every interaction within the estate. Each day brought a reminder that the household had shifted irreversibly, that the routines once taken for granted had become fraught with moral tension, and that the consequences of actions, small or large, were now visible in the expression and posture of every person. The enslaved workers also felt the change acutely. Though their tasks were unchanged in description, the rhythm and quality had subtly altered. Their movements were more deliberate, their voices lower, their attention constantly scanning for signs of scrutiny. Even a glance from Eleanor, once considered a passing acknowledgement, now seemed capable of defining a day, shaping expectations, and signaling judgment. They observed one another with quiet awareness, noting who had been cooperative, who had faltered, who had spoken too freely in the weeks preceding the climax. Fear and survival had become inseparable, entwined with the moral calculus imposed by the household's fractured order. Each individual carried knowledge of coerced complicity and silent betrayals, and though they had not been the architects of the confrontation, they bore its consequences as acutely as the family itself. Eleanor herself moved through these days with a careful, almost ritualized attention. She checked the rooms as though each had to be verified, each locked door and polished surface a measure of restored authority. At night, she sometimes sat alone, hands folded, staring at empty chairs across from her, as if addressing ghosts of the past or rehearsing conversations yet to occur. Occasionally, she murmured phrases under her breath, fragments of self-justification or commands intended for no one but herself, lines about loyalty, obedience, and the necessity of her actions. Yet when morning came, she resumed her measured walk through the house, her expression composed, her steps unerring, her gaze steady. There was no outward acknowledgement of unease, but those who observed closely could sense the quiet fracture beneath the surface, a tension maintained with exacting precision. As the days grew into weeks, the estate's rhythm settled into a new normal, but one laced with unspoken dread. Each inhabitant faced private reckonings, choices about how to navigate the aftermath, about whether to speak, to remain silent, or to act in ways small and secretive. Charles chose silence and inaction, not from loyalty, but from the exhaustion of moral failure and the understanding that any declaration might only compound the disaster. Margaret, still careful and precise, spoke in hushed tones when she must, never volunteering information, and avoided rooms where the weight of observation pressed heaviest. The children attempted to erase or reshape their memories, to convert fear into something more tolerable, something less morally compromising. The enslaved workers, with instincts honed by generations, observed, calculated, and adapted. They recognized the shape of Eleanor's authority, the parameters of obedience, and the vulnerabilities she could not, or would not, acknowledge. And yet, despite the careful orchestration of daily life, fragments of truth persisted, tucked into hidden papers, letters, and marginal notes that no one dared to discuss. In the attic, behind the cedar chest, small bundles of observations and reflections accumulated, written by hands that sought to preserve a record of what had transpired, even if only for themselves. Some described Eleanor's directives, some the moments of coerced betrayal, some the anxieties and fear of those caught in the house's rigid order. Whether these fragments survived into the wider world is uncertain, but in them lay a testament to the enduring weight of human choices and the fragile persistence of memory, of moral witness that cannot be entirely erased, even by fear or silence. Eleanor's own understanding of her legacy began to shift subtly. The authority she had wielded with such confidence now appeared colder, more hollow. The family complied, the workers obeyed, but the warmth, the trust, the semblance of cohesion that had once underpinned the household's function was gone. What remained was order achieved through calculation and intimidation, but it was brittle, and she sensed it. The storm she had unleashed had cleared, yet the air remained charged, unsettled. Respect had been replaced with fear, fear with cautious distance, and the distance itself became an invisible barrier separating her from the people who still performed the motions of loyalty and compliance. Eleanor could maintain her power, but she had become aware, perhaps for the first time, that power exercised alone is a lonely vigilance, a command that sustains authority without communion or acknowledgement. In the reflective quiet that followed, one could observe the consequences of obedience and coercion radiating outward like ripples in still water. Actions taken in the name of compliance had led inexorably to moral fracture. Silence had amplified guilt. Participation, even when compelled, had left indelible marks. The estate itself became a record of human choices, a slow-motion ledger of fear, shame, and the invisible weight of witnessing cruelty. And those who lived within its bounds carried these marks forward, shaping their decisions, their relationships, and their capacity for trust long after the immediate events had passed. If we step back and consider the story of the Whitmore estate from a modern perspective, we are compelled not to seek villains in isolation, but to examine the systems that make obedience itself a form of violence. Eleanor Whitmore's household did not collapse from dramatic upheaval. It fractured under the quiet, persistent weight of choice, fear, and coercion. Those who complied did so not because they desired harm, but because they were confronted with circumstances that demanded either compliance or moral injury. The consequences were psychological, relational, and enduring. They remind us that cruelty does not always require overt aggression. It can thrive in silence, in expectation, in the careful calibration of authority, and in the subtle manipulation of loyalty. So as we close the record of the Whitmore estate, we are left with questions that resonate beyond history. How do ordinary people navigate systems of power that demand moral compromise? When does survival justify participation in cruelty? And what does it mean to witness wrongdoing without intervening? The answer is rarely simple, often uncomfortable, and always a mirror to the structures and choices that persist around us. Reflecting on these events, we are invited to consider our own thresholds of obedience and courage, to confront the ways systems shape behavior, and to recognize that the legacies of human action are often inscribed not in spectacle, but in the quiet, enduring consequences of decisions made under pressure, fear, and the relentless weight of expectation.